Jason sat in his makeshift workshop, the low hum of machinery and the cold silence of the barren moon stretching endlessly beyond. His hands were calloused, his tools well-worn, and the quiet had become his closest companion. The moon had no name worth remembering, just another lonely rock where miners and traders occasionally passed through, leaving as quickly as they arrived. He liked it here, alone, away from the noise of crowded spaceports and the drama of human society. Yet, there was always a small part of him that craved something different, a challenge, or even just a meaningful conversation. The desolate landscape outside his small base was unforgiving, an endless stretch of dust and jagged cliffs. Jason kept busy maintaining the outpost, tinkering with whatever equipment came his way, and ensuring the station was operational for anyone passing through. It was enough to keep his mind occupied, but not enough to quell the creeping boredom that set in during long stretches of solitude. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the air, jarring Jason from his thoughts. He bolted upright, grabbing his toolkit instinctively. He hadn't heard a ship approach, which was strange in itself. He pulled on his gear and stepped outside, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, smoke rose from a smoldering wreck, a ship, but unlike anything he had seen before. Its sleek, alien design shimmered under the harsh moonlight, a blend of curves and sharp edges that spoke of advanced technology. Cautiously, he approached the downed craft, his heart racing. As he got closer, he saw the damage. The ship had clearly taken heavy fire, and its engine was leaking some kind of strange, iridescent fluid. Jason hesitated, unsure if whoever, or whatever, was inside might be hostile. The hatch creaked open, and a figure stumbled out. It was a woman, but not human. Tall and elegant, with striking, angular features, her skin a pale silver that reflected the light. Her eyes, though fierce, were clouded with pain and exhaustion. She was clearly injured, and her clothes, an intricate set of armor and robes, were torn and burned in places. She looked at him with suspicion, but there was no malice in her gaze, just exhaustion. Jason held up his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "Hey, you need help?" The alien woman straightened, her regal bearing evident even in her weakened state. Her voice, when she spoke, was melodic but laced with wariness. "Who are you? What is this place?" "Just a mechanic," Jason replied, keeping his voice calm. "You're on a mining outpost. Looks like your ship's in bad shape." She swayed slightly, clearly trying to stay upright. "I don't need your help." Jason glanced at the ship, noting the extent of the damage. "You might not want it, but you need it. Your ship's not flying anywhere in that condition." The woman's expression tightened, and for a moment, Jason thought she would refuse again. But then she exhaled slowly, her eyes softening, if only a little. "I have no choice. I cannot repair it myself." Jason nodded. "I'll take a look." He moved toward the ship, careful to keep his movements slow and deliberate. Whoever she was clearly in a bad spot. As he started to examine the ship's damaged components, the woman watched him closely. "Who are you really?" she asked after a moment. "You seem too capable for just a mechanic on a forgotten rock." "Name's Jason," he replied without looking up. "I fix things. Doesn't get more complicated than that." She hesitated before responding, her voice softer now, more tired. "My name is Valina. I am being hunted. Assassins from my empire. I managed to escape, but they won't stop until I'm dead." Jason glanced at her, catching a glimpse of the pain she was hiding. "Assassins? Sounds serious. Your ship took a beating." "What happened?" "I barely made it out alive. They fired on me the moment I broke orbit. My guards sacrificed themselves so I could escape." Valina's voice faltered, though she quickly regained her composure. "You shouldn't get involved. This is beyond your concern." "Too late for that," Jason muttered as he worked. "I've already started on your ship. Besides, I don't have a habit of letting people bleed out on my doorstep." Valina watched him in silence, a mix of uncertainty and gratitude in her gaze. She was clearly used to commanding respect, but right now, she was in no position to refuse help. "I'll do what I can to get you back in the air," Jason said, focusing on the ship's engine. "But it's gonna take time. You're stuck here for a while, so you might as well trust me." Valina didn't reply immediately, but after a moment, she gave a small nod. "I don't have a choice, do I?" "No," Jason said simply. "You don't." Jason knelt next to the ship, examining the scorched hull and torn wiring. His fingers traced the sleek lines of alien technology, clearly beyond anything he'd ever worked with before. He muttered to himself, both impressed and baffled by the complexity. This was light years ahead of what he'd seen on human vessels, but that only made him more determined to fix it. He'd always loved a challenge, and this was the biggest one yet. As he dug deeper into the engine, his mind raced to figure out how to integrate human tools with alien tech. Valina stood nearby, arms crossed, her eyes watching his every move. Jason could feel the weight of her gaze, the subtle tension in the air. She was cautious, not entirely trusting, and he could tell she was assessing him just as much as he was assessing her ship. But despite the scrutiny, she let him proceed, and that was a start. "This is something else," Jason said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I've never seen tech like this, but I think I can make it work." Valina tilted her head, studying him. "You understand more than I expected for a human." Jason smirked. "We're good at improvising." Valina's expression softened just slightly, a flicker of interest in her eyes as she continued to watch him work. Jason began making adjustments, rerouting wires, using parts from his own station to bridge the gaps in the damaged circuits. It wasn't perfect, but it might just hold long enough to get her out of here. Every move he made was precise, calculated, and resourceful. As he worked, Valina's guarded demeanor slowly shifted. She began asking him questions, not just about the ship, but about his life, his work on the outpost, and the human way of thinking. At first, Jason gave simple answers, focused on the task at hand. But as the hours passed and the conversation deepened, he found himself talking more openly. He explained how humans valued adaptability, how their survival often depended on thinking fast and making do with what they had. Valina seemed intrigued, her tone less guarded as she revealed more about herself. She spoke of her empire, a place of strict hierarchies and rigid control. Jason could hear the bitterness in her voice as she described the constraints, the expectations placed on her as a member of the ruling class. She mentioned, almost offhandedly, how relationships, especially personal ones, were tightly regulated. Emotions, love, were considered distractions, weaknesses even. Jason raised an eyebrow at that, glancing over at her. "That sounds harsh," he said. "So you've never had a choice? Never just been able to be yourself?" Valina's gaze faltered, something vulnerable flickering across her face before she quickly masked it. "It's complicated." Jason nodded but didn't press her further. He could see she wasn't used to being open about her feelings, and something told him there was more to her than the regal exterior. He went back to focusing on the ship, though the tension between them lingered, a quiet, unspoken connection growing stronger with every exchange. Just as he was nearing a breakthrough in the repairs, an alarm on Valina's wrist console blared. Her expression tightened instantly, all the softness from their conversation vanishing. Jason straightened up, scanning the horizon. In the distance, he saw it, a small drone, gliding low across the surface of the moon. Its sleek, black frame gleamed menacingly as it approached. "They've found me," Valina said, her voice tense. Jason's mind raced. He had to act quickly. The ship wasn't ready to take off yet, and the drone was closing in fast. Valina, despite her injury, was already moving toward a panel on her ship's hull, activating the ship's defensive systems. But with the power still limited, there was only so much the ship could do. Jason grabbed a nearby tool, one of the more powerful energy rifles he kept for emergencies. It wasn't meant for high-tech threats like this, but it would have to do. He turned to Valina. "We need to take that thing down before it signals back." Valina nodded, her warrior instincts kicking in despite her weariness. Together, they positioned themselves, using the terrain for cover as the drone drew closer. Jason took aim, his heart pounding, while Valina activated the ship's limited shield system to provide some protection. The drone fired first, a barrage of lasers slicing through the air. Jason ducked behind a rock, barely avoiding the blast, then returned fire. His shot hit the drone, but it only staggered it. Valina, moving with surprising agility despite her injuries, flanked the drone, activating a pulse from her wrist device that short-circuited its systems. The drone faltered, sparks flying from its frame. Jason saw his chance and fired again, this time hitting its core. The drone exploded in a shower of sparks and debris, falling lifeless to the ground. Panting, Jason lowered the rifle, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Valina approached him, her breathing heavy but her expression calm. For a moment, they stood in the aftermath, side by side, their victory shared in silence. "You're good in a fight," Valina said, her voice softer now, almost admiring. Jason chuckled, wiping the sweat from his brow. "We humans, we improvise." Valina's lips quirked into a small smile, a rare gesture that caught Jason off guard. In that moment, something shifted between them. The danger had drawn them closer, not just as allies, but as two people who had fought together, survived together. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was loaded with unspoken words, feelings that neither of them were ready to address yet. But as Jason returned to working on the ship, the tension between them was no longer just about survival. Something else had taken root, something deeper. Jason wiped his hands on a rag, stepping back to admire his work. The once damaged ship now hummed with energy, its sleek alien form restored. He had done it. He'd managed to repair technology far beyond anything he'd encountered before. The ship's systems flickered to life, a soft glow emanating from its core. Jason couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. This had been his biggest challenge yet, and somehow, he'd pulled it off. Valina stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the ship. Her expression had softened, the guarded wariness now replaced with something close to awe. "I didn't think it was possible," she said, her voice quiet but filled with genuine gratitude. "You've done more than I could have imagined, Jason. You've given me a chance to survive." Jason shrugged, trying to downplay the gravity of what he'd accomplished, though he couldn't hide the smile tugging at his lips. "I told you, humans are good at figuring things out." He turned to face her, their eyes meeting for a brief moment, and the air between them seemed to thicken with an unspoken understanding. For a moment they stood in silence, the hum of the ship a distant background noise to the tension that had been building between them. Valina, her regal posture still intact, took a step closer. There was a shift in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before, a vulnerability that Jason hadn't seen from her until now. "There is something I must offer you, something from my culture," she began, her voice steady, but Jason could sense the weight of what she was about to say. "Among my people, we honor those who show exceptional skill and bravery with a gift. You've saved me, Jason. You've repaired my ship and given me a way to escape. And for that, I offer myself to you." Jason blinked, the words sinking in slowly. "You what?" he stammered, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. Valina took another step toward him, her gaze unwavering. "I offer myself to you. As a reward, as a partner, as a lover. It is not a decision I take lightly, but you have earned it in every way." Jason's mind raced. He had been drawn to her from the moment they met, and over the past few days, the attraction had only grown stronger. But this was something else entirely. He hesitated, glancing at the ship, then back at her. "Valina, I didn't help you for a reward. I just did what was right." "I know," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "That's why I'm offering this. You've shown me compassion, skill, and bravery, things I've rarely seen, even in my own people. And you've risked your life for mine without hesitation. You are different, Jason. And I want to honor that in the only way I know how." Jason swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He didn't want to take advantage of her, not when she was vulnerable, but at the same time, the connection they had forged was undeniable. He'd been trying to ignore his feelings for her, trying to stay focused on the repairs, but now, standing here with her so close, the air thick with tension, he couldn't deny what he wanted any longer. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. "This isn't just because of the ship?" Valina shook her head, stepping even closer until they were just inches apart. "It's because of everything. I've been running for so long, following orders, living by rules that never allowed me to feel anything real. But with you, I feel something different. I feel free. And I want to share that with you." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Jason could see the truth in her eyes, the raw honesty in her offer. It wasn't just about gratitude, it was about the connection they had built, the trust that had grown between them. And in that moment, he knew what he wanted too. He reached out, his hand gently brushing against her arm. Valina closed her eyes at the touch, a soft sigh escaping her lips. And then, without another word, they moved toward each other, the distance between them closing as they finally gave into the pull that had been drawing them together since the moment they met. In the safety of the ship, their connection deepened. It wasn't just about the physical. Their shared experiences, their fears, their hopes, all came together in that moment. Jason felt like he was no longer just the mechanic from a forgotten outpost. He was something more, something bigger, standing beside a woman who had seen the universe and chosen him. Valina, for the first time in her life, allowed herself to let go of her duty, her title, her past. With Jason, she could be just Valina, not the princess on the run, not the warrior bound by the rigid expectations of her empire. In his arms, she found a freedom she had never known, a freedom that went beyond the escape from her pursuers. Their time together felt transformative, as if they were both shedding their old selves and stepping into something new. They were from different worlds, different lives, but in that moment, none of that mattered. What they shared wasn't just about desire. It was about finding something neither of them had known they needed. When they finally pulled away, the weight of the universe seemed a little lighter. Jason looked at Valina, his heart pounding but steady, and saw in her eyes the same emotion that had been stirring in his own chest. They weren't just two people brought together by chance. They were something more now, something that transcended the barriers of species and circumstance. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he wasn't alone. And neither did she. Jason stood outside the ship, the soft glow of the early morning light casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The silence of the moon, once comforting in its solitude, now felt heavy, filled with the weight of the impending goodbye. Inside the ship, he could hear the faint hum of systems coming online, signaling that everything was ready for Valina's departure. He had done his job. The ship was repaired, fully operational, and she could leave whenever she was ready. Valina emerged from the ship, her posture composed but her expression betraying the mix of emotions beneath. She looked at Jason, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The unspoken understanding that this was the end hung between them. They had shared something deep, something that went beyond words, and now it was time to part ways. Jason's heart tightened. He didn't want her to go, but he knew better than to ask her to stay. Still, he couldn't help himself. "You don't have to leave, you know," he said quietly. "Or, if you want, I could come with you." Valina's gaze softened, but she shook her head. "You know I can't," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I have responsibilities. There are people depending on me, and my path is dangerous. If you came with me, it would put us both at risk." Jason swallowed hard, nodding even though the words stung. He understood, but it didn't make it any easier. I don't want this to be the end." Valina stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest, her touch light but grounding. "It's not the end, Jason. What we shared, it will stay with me, always. But we belong to different worlds, and for now, those worlds must remain apart." Jason sighed, knowing she was right. He had known from the beginning that this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it to hurt this much. Valina, ever composed, seemed to sense his inner conflict. Without a word, she reached into a compartment on her wrist and pulled out a small, intricately designed object. She pressed it into his hand. "This is a parting gift," she said. "It's a token from my people. With it, you will have access to knowledge far beyond what your world has seen. It's not much, but it's something I can leave with you." Jason looked down at the object, turning it over in his hand. It was beautiful, alien, and undoubtedly powerful. But it was more than just a piece of technology. It was a symbol of their connection, a reminder that what they had shared was real. He looked up at her, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," he said softly. "For everything." Valina stepped even closer, and before Jason could say anything more, she kissed him. It was soft, lingering, filled with unspoken words and emotions too complex to be expressed aloud. When she pulled away, there was a quiet sadness in her eyes, but also peace. "Goodbye, Jason," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the gentle hum of the ship. Jason watched as she turned and walked toward the ship, the door sliding shut behind her. Moments later, the engines flared to life, and the ship began to rise, the sleek form lifting effortlessly into the sky. Jason stood there, watching as it ascended, higher and higher, until it was just a small dot in the vast expanse of space. And then, she was gone. For a long while, Jason didn't move. He stood on the desolate moon, staring up at the empty sky, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. She had left, and with her, something inside him felt different. Not empty, but changed. He looked down at the small token in his hand, running his thumb over its smooth surface. This encounter had been more than he ever could have imagined. He hadn't just repaired her ship, he had glimpsed something larger, something that went beyond the isolated life he had known. Valina had shown him a world filled with complexities and emotions he hadn't fully grasped before. She had opened his eyes to a universe far broader than he'd ever considered, one filled with danger, but also with connection and possibility. He thought back to their conversations, the way she had talked about her people, her rigid life, and the freedom she had tasted with him. And he realized, in helping her, he had found something too. He had found a sense of purpose, a belief that humanity's role in the universe was not as small as he once thought. Valina had shown him that humans had something unique to offer, something that could bridge gaps between even the most distant of cultures. Compassion, ingenuity, love, these were qualities that went beyond borders, beyond species. Jason's gaze drifted back to the stars, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. Though she was gone, the connection they had shared remained. And in the quiet of the barren moon, he felt something shift within himself, a renewed sense of purpose, a desire to see what else was out there, what other connections could be made. He had been alone for so long, but now, he knew he wasn't truly alone anymore. The universe was vast, but it was also filled with possibilities. And as Jason stood there, reflecting on everything that had happened, he knew one thing for certain. He would never be the same again.